So as we were saying, this is a presentation on electric vehicles and specifically the impact in South Africa. This work was actually published in Energy for Sustainable Development, Elsevier article, and yeah, I'm just very excited to present it to you guys. And yeah, so the agenda of this presentation, I just want to discuss the background in terms of what this project was formed around, its objectives and goals that we wanted and aimed to set out to achieve, simulation overview just in terms of the methodology used and any assumptions that may have been made, the results that followed from these, and then a conclusive statement. Moving on, we have the background obviously with electric vehicles being brought up in recent times with just a way to mitigate against carbon emissions, which have been such a problem for so long. Specifically in terms of South Africa for carbon emissions, in 2015 it was ranked the 14th largest CO2 emitter globally with 512 billion kilograms in that year alone emitted. And this is largely due to Eskom's strong coal dependence. And currently, there's only plans to increase it, not even decrease or decommission these coal power plants. Contributing to the yearly CO2 emissions, we also have the transport sector, which is estimated to be around accounting for 13% of the yearly emissions. So it's not obviously just all of the energy supply, but it's also some accounts for the transport. So with electric vehicles being a possible mitigation technique to reducing emissions, popular for the fact that there's no tailpipe emissions, which I'm sure you guys know, not having to propel the vehicle with a combustion of petrol or diesel, rather using an electric vehicle battery. One of the claims being made is that they're green and that even if you use coal to generate electricity and charge these electric vehicles, there will be less emissions associated than utilizing a combustion vehicle. The next assumption that is often made is that they'll be cheaper than combustion vehicles with regards to operational costs. And in this, I'm simply just speaking actually about the cost of refueling a combustion engine vehicle with petrol or diesel compared to the cost of electricity to charge an electric vehicle. So one of the techniques in terms of helping electric vehicles be integrated into the grids and stuff is utilizing solar energy. And South Africa is in a great place for that as it has very high solar radiation levels. And then one of the things that often goes hand in hand with these solar PV systems being installed is that it would include batteries to actually make use of this energy, but this can actually be avoided if we just utilize the fact that a third of the population is driving to work every workday and their vehicles are stationary at a large scale or at a place of business. So if their vehicles were charged, say, at work during the middle of the day, they wouldn't necessarily have to charge when they get home, and therefore being able to use renewable energy without the need of batteries. Our objectives in terms of investigating these electric vehicles was really to verify, are they really green as the claim is made? Are they cleaner than combustion engine vehicles? Are they cheaper to operate with refueling or recharging rather? Will electric vehicles negatively impact the grid? This being largely due to the fact of concern of Eskom struggling at the moment to keep the lights on with clever load shedding techniques to prevent the grid from failing. And a group of electric vehicles charging all at once will only actually negatively impact this. So we wanted to kind of see how bad is it, and is it really a concern, or is it just whatever? And then we wanted to look at solar PV carports and renewable energy specifically, just to see if we can help remove some of these negative impacts and actually make a really good case for electric vehicles in South Africa. We did this by looking at simulating a combination of scenarios and perspectives, and this was done to really look at the energy consumption related to charging electric vehicles and those associated carbon emissions. Also looking at the peak load demand, determining if it's going to bring instability to the grid, and then looking at financial costs or revenue entailed, recharging purposes and supplying energy. Doing this, as I said, we'll be doing it in 3 perspectives and scenarios. We did do it in 3 perspectives and scenarios. The first one being a grid perspective. And this is done simulating 1 million electric vehicles. The second being a large-scale employer, or in this case, a university, Stellenbosch in particular, with 1,000 electric vehicles. And the third perspective being an electric vehicle car owner with simply just 1 electric vehicle. For each of these perspectives, we wanted to investigate a combination of scenarios. Combustion engines we felt was very important just to kind of provide a baseline in some cases, especially with carbon emissions and such. The remaining are actually all electric vehicle charging strategies. So with this, we wanted to investigate how does it look if electric vehicles are charging only at home, if they're only charging at work, or if they're charging at home and at work. It's important to note that the work charging strategies here, so the last 2, include a grid-tied PV carport system, just making use of renewable energy that is available and using it to feed back into the building or the grid in terms of reducing the amount of energy drawn from the grid. And in doing this, we utilized a simulation model as follows, consisting of, we simulated electric vehicle statistics, or multiple electric vehicles, making use of a mobility model and then a battery model. This was done just to simulate the traveling of these vehicles, as well as the energy required to sustain these travels. And then on top of that, in looking at the energy, the renewable energy, we did a PV model that implements historical weather data, actually, to just kind of feed energy back into the simulation and actually compare how well this mitigation technique might actually benefit. And all of this energy can actually be overlaid with recorded electrical usage data. So in the case of the grid, making use of recorded Eskom data, and in terms of the university, making use of historical data recorded for that, for the different buildings. That all providing us a way to actually evaluate the electricity, the energy consumed, and its relative carbon emissions, and determine if there would be any financial costs or savings, and then look at peak load demands if there's an increase or decrease. As I was discussing the mobility model, we use the assumption of fitting a Gaussian distribution to simulate the arrival and departure times, which is based on an 8-hour workday from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And utilizing a Stellenbosch census, we actually used it to base our travel distance for each electric vehicle. The PV model consists of a grid-tied system in which we designed that if you have a solar PV carport, one carport can fit 2 electric vehicles under it while providing shade. And it's consisting of 10 PV modules and a single inverter per carport. This was done in a modular capacity so that it could be scaled easily. The model used in terms of data-wise, we used a PV-lib model, commonly done in a Python environment, which incorporates the weather data from the Stellenbosch University SOMBC and utilizes 2 widely used inverter and PV module models, known as the Sam King model and then the single diode model. Looking at the financial side of things, looking at the electricity from the grid, we based prices and rates off of the Stellenbosch municipality, off of their tariff rates, just as a baseline. With any electricity being bought from the grid to the university is implemented using a time of use rates, which is currently the case with the university. And any electricity that is sold to electric vehicle, we utilize a 1 Rand 50 per kilowatt hour rate. An owner is then obviously able to buy electricity at work at 1 Rand 50, or if he buys electricity at home, makes use of the sliding scale rates that he would be using to purchase his other electricity. Using the final tier in this, an owner would pay per kilowatt hour somewhere between 1 Rand 90 to 2 Rand 20 per kilowatt hour, obviously providing a benefit to charging at work. The cost of the PV system, which is a quote from Energy Partners, is estimated around 14 Rand per watt peak, with an infrastructure cost of 15,000 Rand per electric vehicle charger. Our car assumptions look at an electric vehicle efficiency of 16.57 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers with a 40 kilowatt hour battery, and this comes out to a possible driving range of around 220 kilometers, obviously less than your typical combustion engine vehicle. And then the combustion efficiency is actually done as a 6.3 liters per 100 kilometers. Our grid assumptions looks at the carbon emissions and the installed generation capacity currently at 49,000 megawatts, which is found in the Eskom annual generator reports. So moving on to the results, we have here a daily profile of what the grid's energy data would look like if we overlaid 1 million electric vehicles charging on top of it. The y-axis is provided in gigawatt hours and is the peak demand, and the x-axis is the time of day for a typical sunny day in January. We can see here the grid. This is the historical data that was recorded, and then the electric vehicle data is applied on top of it. We can see from this that the home charging has quite a substantial peak in the evening, but obviously does not have a peak in the morning, while work charging is quite the opposite. It has a morning peak and doesn't have the evening peak. Home and work charging has a reduced peak and a shorter duration for these peaks, as it's able to split the load across both times a day. Renewable energy fed into the grid can be seen as this dip below the recorded peak demand of the day. We wanted to investigate, one of the things was how many electric vehicles would it take to break the grid? How many electric vehicles would it take to surpass the installed grid capacity with a number of electric vehicles? And in doing so, on the y-axis, we have the number of electric vehicles required to surpass this installed capacity in figures of the millions. And on the x-axis, we have the month in which these occurred. It can be seen that home charging has by far it requires the smallest number of electric vehicles and is the worst, with close to 4.2 million electric vehicles only being required to surpass the installed capacity currently, while work charging performs the best for the majority of the months, and home and work charging performs second best, with them being very closely related. This advantage is obviously due to the fact that the solar energy with the solar carports considered for work charging and home and work charging are feeding energy back and requiring less energy from the grid. In terms of carbon emissions, in this case, we just wanted to consider applicable cases. So in terms of the grid perspective, the petrol vehicles aren't really considered in the figure, as they have no attributed petrol emissions to electricity generated. However, home charging and the other scenarios do. It can be seen that on the y-axis, we're looking at the amount of monthly carbon emissions generated in terms of 1 million kilogram increments. Home charging is shown at the top here, which is shown to be quite high, with 200 million kilograms per month roughly, while the two work charging scenarios, which involve these solar carports, have actually negative emissions for a number of the months, while the less sunny months are then obviously positive. So this is quite an interesting finding. It is important to note that both of them happen to be the same, which happen to be from the total amount of energy generated from the renewable energy is fed back into the grid, and the time of use isn't affecting the overall monthly energy consumption. In terms of a yearly aggregate amounts, we do provide in this case just quickly as a baseline in terms of what 1 million petrol vehicles would look like, and a yearly aggregate amount of 2.2 billion kilograms emitted, whereas electric vehicles only charging at home contribute 2.7 billion. So 500 million more kilograms of kilograms of carbon emissions are generated from electric vehicles only charging at home, which is quite an interesting find. The work charging scenarios, obviously as shown above, with being negative for most of the months, comes out to a net negative, which is very interesting. Moving on to a large-scale employer, or in this case, the university, we have the recorded historical peak demand shown as the petrol and home charging case here. And that's just to serve as a baseline of what the previous peak demand usage used to be. And now overlaying 1,000 electric vehicles charging on top of this data, we have here the peak demand provided for each charging scenario in MVA, and it's shown to be about 3.5 to 4 MVA for each respective month. Once again, work charging and home and work charging doesn't appear to be a large difference in this regard. Moving on to the financial side of that the university could entail is the amount of monthly revenue generated from electric vehicle charging and reduced savings from electricity consumption. We have petrol vehicles and home charging obviously being zero because there would be no possible revenue generated for the university in that case. Whereas work charging and home and work charging follow a very similar trend here. Whereas work charging is definitely seen to be having a higher financial revenue than those charging at home and work, which is due to the fact that there's more electricity sales occurring. Looking at their total carbon emissions, the work charging definitely has a larger CO2 impact than those charging at home and work. The y-axis on this figure is shown to be in 1,000 kilogram increments of CO2 emitted. And yeah, it's interesting because the home and work charging has this huge reduction, and I mean is net negative throughout every month. This is largely due to the fact that the electrical load is now split amongst work and at home. So therefore, electric vehicles are only charging half the amount they would need to. And that additional energy generated from the solar carports is fed back into the building, reducing the amount of grid energy consumed. Looking at these yearly aggregates, it's quite clear that the carbon emissions is quite a large jump for the vehicles charging at work and at home, with a negative 1.5 million kilograms of CO2 emitted versus work, which has a negative 189,000 kilograms. Whereas the revenue, it's very similar, 1.6 million Rand versus 1.4 million Rand. So work charging in this case, obviously, definitely being more beneficial in terms of financial, but not by much. In terms of an electric vehicle owner, however, we have the costs provided here in rands on the y-axis and the monthly costs of recharging an electric vehicle or refueling a petrol-based vehicle. We can see clearly that the petrol vehicles have quite a more expensive monthly charge here, with the refueling of petrol being around, obviously, above 1,000 Rand for almost every month, whereas electric vehicles only charging at work has by far the best financial benefit for electric vehicle owners, with coming in second best, second best coming in with those charging at home and at work. And this is obviously due to electricity being bought at 1 Rand 50 versus the 1 Rand 90 or 2 Rand 20. Looking at their carbon emissions, we looked at only the electricity generated and then cut back by the amount of PV used. We see here that work charging has definitely a cleaner environmental impact than all the other scenarios, and in the month of May does surpass the one above it, but throughout the rest of the month is by far cleaner. Funny enough, though, we do find that a petrol vehicle happens to be the second cleanest scenario, being cleaner than vehicles charging at home and even vehicles charging at home and at work. This kind of shows us that the carbon emission rate in terms of the grid electricity is quite high, and higher than a vehicle can produce in terms of the consumption of petrol, which is the opposite of what the assumptions have been made in the past. And then finally with this, the home charging is shown obviously to be the highest carbon emitter. Looking at the yearly aggregates for this, we found that carbon emissions of home charging being 2,700 kilograms emitted yearly, while a petrol vehicle has 2,200 kilograms, so 500 kilograms less, whereas work charging has about 200 kilograms less than a petrol vehicle. Whereas costs, it was seen and is seen here that it is far more expensive to refuel an electric vehicle, refuel a petrol-based vehicle than it would be to charge an electric vehicle at 16,000 Rand versus 4,000 Rand when an electric vehicle is charged solely at work. And then charging at work and home, which is more likely to happen, is only 5,500 Rand. So concluding this, these findings show us quite interesting things regarding the assumptions made with electric vehicles. It shows us that it's not always necessarily greener on the other side in terms of electric vehicles aren't always going to be cleaner than a petrol-based vehicle, depending on the electricity you're using and the carbon emission rate of that. It also shows us that load peak demands can jeopardize the grid stability and needs to be accounted for. And other ways to do that as well can be doing clever charging techniques to prevent everyone charging at the same time. The good news is with electric vehicles, it doesn't mean that it isn't a good solution. It just means that we need to account for ways to mitigate it further, and tipping the scales, we can do this with renewable energy, such as making use of solar PV carports, offering not only financial benefits, but also grid stability and fewer emissions. And that is the end of this presentation. Thank you for this opportunity and listening. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them at this time.